Hello everyone, just a quick video then to talk through the pre-release booklet for 2022. One sort of handy thing to note before you go any further is you do need your copy of the pre-release with you whilst we go through the video. That's just because I can't put any pictures or any words in from the pre-release booklet due to copyright, but I will mention the page numbers, the figures and the things that I refer to talk about as we go through the video. So if you need to pause now to go and grab the booklet, please do. You might also find it useful to have your geography booklet and the revision notes you've done so far with you as we go along. So, as it says on the first slide then, I'm sure you're aware the pre-release booklet this year is all about this new type of waste management and the waste incinerator then, and they're trying to build one just outside of Cambridge. And this whole booklet follows then this proposal and whether they are right to build this waste incinerator for Cambridge and sort of some of the background information to it. So as it says on the front cover of your pre-release booklet then, this is made up of 3 figures. So the first figure you've got, figure 1, is all about managing waste in the UK, so that's on pages 2 to 3. Figure 2 is all about this proposed energy from the waste incinerator, so if you like the advantages of it, and that's on pages 4 and 5. And figure 3 then sort of is the other side of the argument, the disadvantages perhaps, and sort of where the proposal's at now. Perhaps a really timely reminder, in case you don't know all of this, but the paper 3 exam is on the 14th of June, it's at 9 a.m. And section A, which is the questions you're going to be asked in this pre-release booklet we're going to talk about now, is worth 40 marks. Then for 16 marks, you've got what's called unseen fieldwork this year, so some sort of generic fieldwork type questions. You've got about a mark a minute, you've got 4 minutes spare, so perhaps use those 4 minutes wisely for planning. And as I said to you, section A then is obviously on that waste management. This whole booklet then that we're going to talk through now is worth 40 marks, we know that already, out of a total of 202 marks on your GCSE, so it's equivalent to a fifth then of your grade, so well worth putting in the time then to revise it. So the first thing that sort of stands out to me when I go through this booklet is this concept of sustainability. I think that a lot of this booklet and a lot of the questions you're going to get are going to be framed around this word. If I'm thinking about sustainability, there's sort of one big trap that students normally fall into. And the first trap that students normally fall into is saying that sustainability is mostly environmental. Okay? The first thing I would encourage you to do is perhaps do some sort of mind map on this booklet and think about, well, how can we sort of break down this term sustainability? If it was me, I would have one little strand on my diagram for environmental. I would have another strand of sustainability for economic. And last but not least, I would also think about social sustainability. So really important, I suppose the first big key message I want to get across here is don't just see sustainability as being about the environment. Sustainability is about at least all 3 of those things you can see on the screen there working together. Remember, if something's sustainable, it means it's going to meet the needs of today, but also the needs of the future generations as well. So consider, is it good today? Is it good in the future? For each of those 3 areas there you can see on the screen. And also then, to go alongside that, I think there's some big key words in here, some things that you know you've definitely talked about in your lessons, but things that are worth going back and addressing again. In particular, if you look on pages 2 and 3 of the pre-release booklet, that's where most of this terminology seems to come in. So you could possibly be asked to define one of these words in the exam. I think that's highly likely. Think about the ones that perhaps they're likely to ask you to talk about. Anaerobic digestion is just the decomposition or breakdown then of organic matter by bacteria. Commercial is always to do with businesses. Energy from waste. You'll see throughout the booklet as well, this is also referred to as EFW. It means exactly the same thing, it's like an abbreviation of it, but it stands for energy from waste. And then obviously you've got your incineration, landfill and recycling, definitions of those there anywhere on the screen. Rural urban fringe, it's just the area outside the town or city, it's the point where we meet the countryside. The sustainable, look here it is again, look, we've already spent some time talking about that, but that keyword pops up again. And then obviously waste, whole point of the booklet then. If you need to, pause it here and go through this vocab, perhaps do yourself a little glossary on keywords from the booklet if there's words here you're unsure of. But these are the ones that if I was going to learn keywords and definitions for this exam, those would be the ones that I would go with. So if we start on figure 1, so if you haven't done this already, I would open up your pre-release booklet then to pages 2 and 3. So figure 1, as we said, here is just giving us a bit of background then to managing waste in the UK. If I start on the top left-hand side, so if I start on page 2, there's a little section that says Growing Waste Challenge in the UK. I think it's pretty useful to have some background information then about why is waste management a massive concern for the UK. And these facts here sort of help to back that up. So we know in 2018, the UK has produced approximately 225 million tonnes of waste. And of that 225 million tonnes, we've got 140 million tonnes coming from construction, so building, and we've got 27 million tonnes of that waste then coming from household. And that waste could be things like food packaging, plastics, cardboards, etc. But it's still contributing towards that 27 million tonnes. So you've obviously got a little pie chart there. So in the exam, they might ask you to describe the data that's in front of it. If you look just below that, you've also got some data on food waste in the booklet. I think that food waste is also there in that bar chart. They might ask you to do something with that graph. So notice the data only goes up to 2016. So they may well ask you to plot on perhaps the 2018 data. They might ask you to continue that graph. Be prepared, I think, for some sort of maths or graph type question there. If we continue on from that then, the next part of page 2 in its most basic format just explains to you what other alternatives there are out there for managing waste. And there are 5 methods then of waste disposal. Your most popular method of waste disposal then is landfill. And I've already put landfill on the screen. That fact about landfill is something I would use in those longer answer questions. So 45% of UK waste in landfill, that's pretty massive. So we know that majority of our waste disposal currently means that we are burying it in the ground. That's what landfill is. So alternatives to landfill, well, you would have incineration. If I incinerate waste, it purely means I just burn it. I've got recycling. Hopefully you're all familiar with what recycling is. We're all doing loads of that. Then I've got my anaerobic digestion. This is the one that we talked about at the start, but this is just when I've got bacteria breaking that down. And then last but not least then is composting. So perhaps in the exam, you might be asked to weigh up these methods of waste disposal. You might be asked to outline them. If you notice in the booklet, it tells you exactly what these techniques are. So they might ask you for 6 marks to discuss perhaps which one you think is most effective, or they might ask you for 4 marks just to describe these in a little bit more detail. Again, think about which ones of those are likely to be most popular amongst people, who's able to access what. Comes back to that nice word we had at the start, wasn't it? Sustainability. Which ones of these here are going to continue to meet the needs of people, the economy, the environment, not just now, but perhaps also in years to come as well. Then on page 2, you've got that chloropleth map. That's the map in the bottom right-hand corner of page 2 that's got all those nice bright blues and greens on it. Again, you could be asked here to describe the data. I've picked out a couple of the key points that I think are particularly useful if you're describing the data. Have a little look at the key. First thing I would do when I describe the data type question is look at that key. So the key here is saying to us that as we move towards that really dark green colour, we've got 51% or more, so a pretty high rate of recycling. Okay. If I then have a little look towards the bottom in that dark blue, that's where the rate is the lowest. So therefore, on the map it even tells us, but the highest rate we've got in East Yorkshire, the lowest rate we've got in Newham in London. Newham is like a borough of London. Okay, so you might well be asked to describe that data, I think, for 2 marks. I think also that map's pretty useful because around the outside of it, you've got some nice stats that you can include as part of those longer answer questions. So perhaps you might want to talk about that 49% of UK councils provide recycling bins. You might want to start to think about why are people not doing as much recycling? What are the issues with recycling? Is it the fact that recycling needs lots of education, it needs a huge media campaign behind it, it's quite onerous on people? But you might say, well, as people are more aware of the risks now, things like climate change and the planet, perhaps we should be encouraging that more. So I think there's something in there, exam question wise, perhaps 4 or 6 marker about that. Right, next up, let's go to page 3, and at the top you've got that beautiful line graph. Again, similarly to the other graphs I pointed out, but expect them to ask you something to do with that data. It seems really odd to me that there is just a graph there and there's no other text or anything else around it. Hence, you'll see that age-old question of describe the data. Again, you might be asked to plot on next year's data. This one goes up to 2019, so slightly more recent than the bar chart and the pie chart anyway that you've got across the page on page 2. Again, just remember, a point here I think to note, that when you're doing that 9 marker at the end, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the video anyway, but you don't just have to draw on figure 3 for that, you can go back into the booklet. So perhaps in your 9 marker, in your introductions, you want to reference what trends you can see in the data on pages 2 and 3 to show that you're able to make links across the whole booklet. Right, let's go then to this idea of the top 5. Okay, the top 5 you've also got on page 3. So it says the top 5 UK plastic waste export destinations in 2018. I think there is probably going to be some sort of multiple choice question that asks you to calculate perhaps the percentage difference here, which one is greater than. You may well be asked again to compare these two. You might be asked to suggest a reason why the rate of plastic export is higher in Malaysia perhaps than it is in the Netherlands. Again, I would have answers to all of those questions ready, and if it reminds me of anything here, it's the fact that you need to take a calculator into the exam with you. Right, at the bottom of page 3, I think they've sort of chucked in these diagrams here, and there's a lot of text above it, but I think it's important you understand the difference then between the linear waste system and what's called a circular waste system. If we have a linear waste system, as you can see the diagram at the bottom of page 3, all you're doing is taking raw materials, you're producing something, people are using it and they're chucking it away. So linear system, in short, is sort of this use and throw away culture. A circular system says, right, yeah, we've used it, but now we can repair it, we can recycle it, and the whole point is we try and lose as little as possible in terms of waste or rubbish, and we're repurposing as much as we possibly can. So out of the two, in theory, the circular system is more environmentally friendly because we're using fewer raw materials, and that way we're keeping the environment, in theory, safer, as it says to your figure 3. Right, next page then. So we've covered off all of figure 1. Figure 2, in short, is just talking to you about the waste proposal. So if you're on page 4, you can see there's quite a bit of text there. Remember, you've got that acronym again, EFW, Energy from Waste, about this proposal and sort of what's involved. Page 5 we'll talk about again very shortly, but page 5 talks you through an OS map extract. Immediately I get goosebumps when I look at page 5 because I think there's so many questions there they can ask you and you need to be prepared for. So if I consider this proposal first then, the top part of figure 2, page 4, is basically outlining the facts. They're trying to sell this waste incinerator and they're saying, right, here's all of the things, I can put bells and whistles on it, fairy lights on it, here's what's going to make this proposal particularly impressive. Okay, the thing to already note is they already have a 162 hectare waste management park near Waterbeach. They've already got one, and yet they're putting in this proposal. They're trying to sell this, and they've got a few bullet points at the bottom where it says key facts. So they're trying to say, well, over 80% of waste is currently going to landfill, but they could incinerate it at this new facility they've got. The fact that it can take 250,000 tonnes of waste per year. We're currently putting 200,000 into landfill, so this can burn even more than we're currently putting in landfill. The fact this is going to generate enough electricity for 63,000 homes, it's going to create over 300 jobs. So if we go back to that key term, sustainability, it's ticking, isn't it? Each of those 3 dimensions. For social, it's got jobs. Again, you could have classed perhaps the electricity there for the homes. If you think about economic, well, the fact it's providing people with jobs, it's more affordable energy. If I think about environmentally sustainable, perhaps burning it is better than putting it into landfill. And then what it shows you underneath in those 2 yellow speech bubbles is the conflicting views. So I think you might be asked to discuss these views in the exam. I think you might need to weigh up the view of the waste manager versus the view of the university lecturer. Okay, just take the time, and I would recommend you take the time now to read through those 2 speech bubbles. If you look at what the waste manager is saying, the waste manager is saying, right, yes, it's going to produce all of this ash, but actually what's going to happen here is it's going to save us a bit of money, it's going to provide energy for all these homes, isn't it amazing? The university lecturer is saying, actually, the cost that this is going to have for the environment isn't particularly great. So the university lecturer is worried about air pollution. Yes, they're acknowledging the fact that it might be cheaper, but also it's going to use a lot of reusable and recyclable materials, it's extremely costly, and they almost see it as being a bit wasteful. So again, you might be asked to weigh up or to discuss these 2 views and perhaps include your own personal viewpoint here. Those 2 speech bubbles I think are particularly useful for the 9 marker. Remember I said you can make links back in the booklet if you need to. So if we consider this OS map extract then, this is the bit where I said I thought this was absolutely magic. I think you're going to be asked quite a few geographical skills question here. I'm expecting to see some sort of multiple choice and then perhaps a short 1 mark answer question based on page 5 in this booklet. I think you're going to be asked to look at the scale of the map. Look at that scale at the bottom. Okay, so have your ruler out ready and measure it up. Again, you might be asked to calculate distance. So perhaps from point A to point B. Height. So just check now, can you see the contours that are on here? I think the contour lines are pretty clear, but just check them. They're little orange lines that have got numbers written on. They tell you about the height of the land then. And last but not least, grid references. What I should have added on here is 4 and 6 figure grid references. So can you do both of them? I think it is highly likely you will be asked to give a grid reference for things on this map. So just check, just pick random things and check that you can do a 4 and 6 figure grid reference for them. Remember, if I'm doing a grid reference, I'm always aiming for that bottom left hand corner, and it's always along the corridor and then up the stairs. So here are some questions then I think you may well be asked based on the map on page 5. Feel free to pause here so you can have a go at these questions. So I think you might be asked about the 6 figure grid reference for the new proposed incinerator. Seems almost funny that that's labelled on for you. You might be asked about the new town. And last but not least, you might be asked to calculate that distance then as well. So as I said, if you want to pause here so you can have a go at these questions, feel free to. Those of you that have paused, here are the answers then. So just check that you're there or thereabouts with my answers, especially for the 6 figure grid references. All I've done to calculate the distance there is use the scale at the bottom. So I've just measured from those 2 sites and then lined it up with that scale at the bottom. So then, final 2 pages of the pre-release. And this is where I always think this is where big money is. This is bound to be then where they're going to ask you the 9 marker. So if you look at figure 3, on the front cover of the booklet, it tells you now it's a burning issue. So now they're going to start to give you a bit more of a critique about whether this proposal is the right thing or not. Remember in figure 2, we already had the arguments for, so it's highly likely now they're going to start to show you a little bit more of the other side of the argument. So figure 3 then says, well, why did they actually want the project? If you have a little look here through some of the information you've got in particular on page 6, there's some sort of huge reasons why I think they were particularly keen on getting this project and getting it off the ground and running. So if we have a little look, the first big reason here why they're selling this is they want the heat and energy for homes. So we talked about that already, but we said particularly good for people, particularly good as this seems to be a slightly lower cost. If you look towards the bottom, again, they want that permission to build the incineration plant on the existing site. Okay, they're trying to do that because it's going to have very little or no additional cost. we can add that one on. When I say no additional cost, they're not having to build new roads and stuff, it already exists. Again, they want it because it's going to save landfill capacity. So that gives us more space to bury that rubbish in the ground should we need to in the future. Again, perhaps it will improve the local environment. So that can sort of come off at that point there, can't it? I've got less going into landfill. Perhaps then it's going to look a bit nicer, definitely smell a bit nicer in the local area. Perhaps it might boost the local economy. If I'm now employing lots of people, people will definitely be happier. I'm going to have more money for services in the local area too. Squeeze the E in there. Right, and that last little bit then down the bottom, I think is particularly important. They're going to follow strict environmental guidelines, which means that air pollution, to use their own words, is not a problem. So they're already considering some of the environmental drawbacks. So we can build this in then a bit more, can't we, to for and against. So perhaps your big arguments for are your 300 jobs. They are the boost of the local economy. You could argue the power for homes. You could say local environment. So you've got less rubbish there going into landfill. And last but not least, you might want to comment on the air pollution and the fact they've already sort of considered some of these arguments already. So then if I go to the top of page 7, there's big concern then about the landscape. So some of the local people here are particularly against this because they think it's going to become a bit of an eyesore. It's not going to look particularly pleasant. Again, it's much higher than any of the local buildings, so I'm not going to add that on because that's already going to fit into the landscape bit. Then it says to keep the incinerator going, it's going to require huge quantities of waste to be brought in from a wider area. So they're concerned about heavy traffic on local roads. So you could argue from there, perhaps they're also concerned a little bit about pollution coming into the area. You could then, I suppose, also argue here you've got other pollutants, and there's still the possibility, isn't there, no matter how good your planning is. You could also argue as well that these plants are particularly expensive, have a high cost, don't they, to start these up. All this money you're having to put in to building this already. So then at the bottom, it's now asking you to consider actually, is this the best method? It says, why bother recycling in the first place? And you've got a waste hierarchy there. At the top, they're saying perhaps what we should be doing is reducing, reusing, recycling. So if you look down the bottom, incineration actually ranks second to last. They put it in place E. So again, you might be asked to consider other alternatives, we said already, but perhaps think is actually reduction of waste, i.e. trying to put a limit on the amount of rubbish people are producing. Is that better than just burning it? Is perhaps actually educating people here about recycling and everything else, is that more beneficial than building this brand new waste incineration plant? So I suppose the 9 marker, I think, really comes perhaps in 2 forms. Perhaps they might ask you about which other alternatives they should consider if there wasn't waste incineration. But I think perhaps the most obvious one here might be, because it says at the bottom, latest update, in June 2020, the proposal to build the waste incineration plant was rejected by the government. So perhaps the 9 marker is going to be something like, to what extent were the government right to reject this new proposal for the waste incineration plant? And obviously you'd use your arguments for or against there. Remember, I've said throughout this video that you can go back to things that I've talked about in figure 1 and figure 2. Don't just limit yourself to using the arguments from figure 3. The examiner loves it when you draw links across the whole booklet, especially in your 6 and 9 markers. So finally, to recap then, this is going to be worth 40 marks. You've got a mark a minute. It's all on waste management. Total is going to be about 1/5 of your GCSE grade. Definitely take a calculator to the exam. Come and see me if you've got any questions about this, and I hope this is fairly straightforward.